Welcome back. I'm delighted to be also welcoming back Eric Say, who's going to be showing us some interesting things to make your workflows better and also more creativity, more iterations when you're working with renders and multipasses and all those things in AOVs that you should be using.
Absolutely. No, that's it. That's it. The whole presentation. I'm done here. Yeah, we got it all done.
Cool. So, yes, great. Over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. Excited to be back. If you caught me the first day, we're going to be going over the same thing, but, I had a chance to think about it a little, and I remember some stuff I forgot to say, so hopefully there's some good nuggets of information. Hello. Good to be here. Excited to be talking. For those of you who don't know me, I am Eric Say. I'm the owner and creative director at Game Day Creative. We're a sports broadcast motion graphics creative agency. We make stuff for television, in particular with an emphasis on sports graphics. I'll play the demo reel. That does a really good job of showing what we do. I'll unmute the demo reel.
Give me that cheddar, get Rico. Big money rolls like burritos. Give me that hot sauce, no pico. Give me that, give me that. 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 Give me that.
Cool. So as you can see, lots of broadcasts, lots of sports, lots of versions, lots of iteration, and I think by nature of what we build, we like to say that we create design systems. So the kind of designs we make aren't the sort of thing where you render them once and you're done. We'll make stuff for player interstitials, headshots, different opens that need to be changed a million times and reworked. We swap out the players, we swap out the teams. By virtue of that, efficiency is a really important part of our workflow, so that's definitely going to tie into what I'm talking about today. But before I get into that, I just love the opportunity anytime I get to talk to fellow creatives to do a little update on at least what's true for us at the status quo of the motion graphics industry. And this is at least through the lens of a broadcast production house. So we're not a VFX company. We definitely do broadcasts. We're not at the, we're not doing hyper simulations for Marvel. But a couple things that's true for us is, one, it is a very good time to be a 3D artist. It is a great time to know how to use cinema. Artists are very much in demand. It's a buyer's market. There's so much work out there. There's so much demand for digital video content. Menu boards at restaurants are videos now. Your tickets on your phone load with an animation now. The whole world is animation now. And we're here at Siggraph, and there's all these booths about AR and VR, and where we see that in my world is virtual sets. Physical sets just aren't getting built anymore. It's way more economic to build it in a virtual space and texture it and move it. But with that, we're also starting to break some of the paradigms. Like, old sets didn't move and animate. They were just built once and they were rigid. And now as 3D artists, as we start to design these AR and VR worlds that are going to be the future, we got to be the architects of that future. And I think that is really exciting. I also like that it's kind of the Wild West. We're going to figure out what some of these new virtual spaces are. Engineers and architects of the past had to worry about things like gravity and structural integrity. And when we go to build these virtual worlds, that doesn't matter. And that's really exciting and fun. So not only are you incredibly employable if you know how to use 3D software, in addition to that, I think it's a really exciting time. A couple other trends is inside of that vein that we notice is texture and asset libraries are really taking over. It's becoming less economical and less efficient to build your stuff from scratch. You're absolutely going to need to know how to get into customize those assets and manipulate them. You're going to have to know how to navigate the node editors, how to get the look you want, and how to bend them to your will. But as a starting point, and to iterate, and to test things, and to find your look, and develop your look, asset libraries are king. Another thing that is creeping up, and I'll just, it's been mentioned before. My team was talking about it all day today. AI-generated art is a thing, and that, if you don't know about it, Google it, look into it. You should at least be familiar with it. I think at this point it's great for making mood boards, and it's a very wonderful tool. It will unemploy all of us in the future. That's fine. No, I think it's an incredible tool, but I personally think it's very exciting. If you're not familiar with it, look it up. And then one last thing I want to touch on is sort of trends, and this is visual trends, particularly in my industry, which is sports graphics. And there's sort of been this trend for large, this is a project we collaborated on, large 3D scenes combined with really good typography and 2D graphics equals sports graphics. And I think the fact that we can identify this trend, that we know what this formula is, probably means that that trend is on the way out. And it's good of us as a company to keep an eye on where we think that trend is heading. And if I was a betting man, I think we're heading towards hyper-realistic simulations. Like, when I say hyper-realistic, beyond reality. This is a package that was done for ESPN. The team there made it, but like just stuff like this, where it's this photo reel and there's fog and stuff rolling. So cool. And I think that sort of like simulation graphics are going to be the future. And I think some of that is because the barrier to entry into simulation is coming down. As EJ was showing cloth simulations and really cool dynamic engines, they start to become available for broadcast packages, not just for Marvel movies. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve in graphic trends, I highly recommend you maybe hit rewind on the roadshow and see what EJ had to say about cloth and physics dynamics. I think that's a really good skill to have. And also it's a very cool visual. Okay, so that's sort of my maybe catch up on where I think the industry's at. I just also I find it fun trying to predict trends, but some of that is probably important for the job as well. So let's get into what I was going to talk about today, which is compositing and AOV passes. We're going to talk about C4D to After Effects and how those two programs talk to each other, with a huge emphasis on efficiency and look development. And again, in my industry, or my niche of the industry, efficiency is king, both because we have to make these design systems that have thousands of iterations. But in addition to that, I also think it improves your creativity. The more iterations you have, the more ideas you can explore, the more avenues, the more stones you can turn over, the better your final product's going to be. So I think efficiency isn't good for just meeting deadlines. It's also important for getting a higher quality product. So we're going to talk about C4D into After Effects with an emphasis on efficiency, which means we're going to be talking a lot about multi-passes. Multi-passes are incredibly powerful. You get a lot of information out of your renders. We're going to go through the AOVs, show you how to use them, show what kind of information comes out of them, which means we're also going to be talking quite a bit about compositing. So I'm going to show you how I take those multi-passes, pull them into After Effects, what I do with them when I get them there, and how to manipulate them. So with that, let's dive into it. So the project I'm going to be showing this through the lens of is this one right here. So this is and we don't have to watch this whole reel, but it's a sports motion graphics package for Telemundo. It's the road to the World Cup, so the tournament leading up to the World Cup. It's a full broadcast graphics package, so we have a lot of things like these matchup interstitials where we show the teams that are playing. There's opens, there's monitors, and one thing when I'll just go over the style and some of the decisions made with this this package real quick. As we were developing the look, we knew we wanted to be true to the look and true to the sport. So we wanted to capture some of the essence of football, as it were. And we originally started by doing some hexagon-based designs, and the deeper we got into that, the more we realized that hexagons haven't been what soccer balls have looked like for well over a decade. Every tournament has a very unique design to it now. All the balls are unique, but they all kind of have some similar shapes. And if I really had to get granular about what those shapes are, they're kind of this, they're like smooth, flowing curves that then hit right angles. And we found we could create geometry that captured the essence of those balls and transform that into a rigid element. And we got a lot of mileage out of that. The other large component of this package is cloth, which worked for a couple reasons. One, it has precedence in sports. There's jerseys, but it particularly is applicable when they are multinational sports because flags are how we visually denote nationality. So there was a huge a huge potential here to leverage cloth. Also, it has rich texture and has some very good implied movement. So there's just a lot to love about cloth as a support. So anyway, this actually frame is the one we're going to be talking about. I think captures the idea well. You'll see this rigid geometry that's based off these soccer ball forms, complemented by cloth. So we kind of knew the look we wanted to achieve, and then we actually had to make it. And I'll get into kind of how we had to make it. And our first idea is we wanted it to look really high production value and use real displacements. But the more we got into our pipeline and we realized we had to make 32 of these matchups at 4K, 60 frames a second, and render hundreds of these, that we couldn't use a full 3D pipeline. We had to get it into After Effects where we could update this displacement in After Effects. So I'll get into that later. But for now, let's start with just kind of the cloth build out and how we got there and what that looks like. So a lot of AOVs were used for this, which is definitely a big part of it. Fire up Cinema here. Booting. And actually here, I can show you here's the scene. So one thing, we did this whole project in Redshift, and as I was thinking about this talk today, years previously, we'd always kind of include some standard render stuff. At this point, back to the status quo of the industry, at this point, if we go to interview a freelancer and they say, oh, I use standard render and physical render, it's kind of a red flag for us. GPU renders are definitely the future. They look beautiful, they're fast, they're efficient. So it's a long way of saying if you haven't picked up one of the additional renders, learn it. We still use standard render, and there's still a time and place for it. And actually, we're going to show some of the features of it today. But you gotta learn the other as well. So let's turn on Redshift and we can take a look at this scene. So the way we build these is we render both countries at once and split it in After Effects to make all the different possible combinations for a matchup. And if I zoom in here, we decided to do real cloth displacement for our first iteration of this. And I really do like how that looks. And better visual, based on the viewing distance and what we wanted to achieve, it looked good. And you can see we had some tessellation issues here, but that kind of looked like scrunched up embroidery to us, so we actually liked the visual of that, so we didn't even bother going in and trying to clean that up, again, from the viewing distance we were at. But one thing that I really think was successful about this, and is just a good, I think, benchmark for graphics, I love if you look at a graphic and you know what it would feel like if you were to touch it. I feel like that's a good level marker of success for a 3D graphic. As far as like texturing detail and lighting and stuff goes. So anyway, I thought we had a really nice tactile cloth here. So I'm going to show you just real quick how we built that cloth. And then inside of this, I'll show you some of the AOV techniques that help us composite that. So this is our Redshift shader tree for this, this cloth pattern. So that whole cloth is done with one shader tree. So you can see it's pretty complicated here, but I'll kind of walk through it. It's not actually that complicated when we look at the steps. I can show you how it's built. And then there's one particular AOV thing I want to get into that I think is particularly powerful. So at the very top of the shader tree, there is a Fresnel. And a Fresnel, I think, is an incredibly powerful stylization tool. It also has some real-world physics potential, but we like to use it to stylize our renders. So actually here, let me pull up the final render of this matchup. What a Fresnel is it's reflectivity based on viewing angle. And the analogy I love to use is if you're looking at a pet store and there's a puppy in the window and you're staring straight at that window, you can see the puppy just fine. If you were to walk next to that window and lay your head against the glass and look along the length of the glass, you would just see reflection. And as you straighten back out to the window, you can again see the puppy. And that's what a Fresnel simulates. It's in this case, it spits out a luminance channel based on viewing angle. What that means for our graphics is up here, when the cloth starts to bellow and is curved, it creates a highlight on that curve, or it amplifies that curve, which helps simulate like fuzz or like the kind of rough nature of cloth, and it adds a little extra highlight that emphasizes those curves. It's just a cool stylization technique to make any of your materials show off their curves a little better. I like to put it into everything. So we ported this into a ramp, and that's so we can just adjust the strength of it really easily without going in here and adjusting the values. It's like a more visual way. And then that goes into this cloth texture. This cloth texture then gets fed into a color correction, which added some contrast, and then into a color mix where we add the blue to it. This then gets fed into the base color of our Redshift material. Also going to this base color is some roughness for reflection and a normals map to give it that nice bump in displacement. Well, not displacement, just bump. That then gets fed into this material blender. What this material blender is doing is it's taking the color from the United States flag texture and cutting it out based on a matte that's being ported into it. And this puts the USA color just where the United States is. These mattes are also being fed into a displacement channel, which go into displacement blenders, which makes the country displaced and the outline of the country displaced even more. Now, all this is getting ported into a store AOV to color, which is a very powerful AOV tool. What this node does is it takes whatever you're porting into it and creates a custom AOV out of it. So in this situation, it's taking the country fill, which is this white, and making an AOV. And if I come back to my render view, I can show that a little better. Switch this to bucket mode and show the country fill AOV. Give that a second to render, and we'll see what that does. So once that populates, you'll see that anywhere on this texture channel where the country is, it creates an AOV for that. But what's really powerful about the store color node is you can put any part of the tree in there, anywhere along the line. So I can store the scratch information, I can store just the bump information, and I can kind of show you here once this renders enough that we can tell what's going on. So if I switch to beauty, you can get, I should have probably zoomed out at rendering all those details as asking a lot of it. But you can see it only shows up where that's being bumped. And that's why that's cool, is like it captures the displacement accurately. Like it'd be tough to create, you couldn't create an object buffer that otherwise identifies the amount, it's only the areas that are being displaced. But if I was to port something else in here, so I'm just gonna grab this khaki texture and drop it into this AOV. The odds of me being able to nail that, got it. And then we refresh this. You'll see that it just spits out that khaki texture with none of the other compositing, none of the color correction added to it, because I did that before it in the shader tree. So it's a really great part of stealing any part of your shader tree and getting a custom AOV out of it. It's also really easy to set up. You just go to the utilities, AOV, store AOV to color, drop this node. The beauty pass is just a pass through, so that's where you would put your main material in, and then you connect that to the output. And then you just drag whatever you want into here, attach it to this AOV, and you go add new custom AOV, Maxon, AOV manager, and it just adds that to the AOV, and it's set up. So I guess, let's see if I can nail this on the shader tree. Come here, node. Cool, AOV input 1. So now this would render another AOV with that color channel in it. So it's really easy to set up, and you get some really cool results. So I just like that as a workflow, but it's a nice segue to the AOV manager in general. So this is going to be the meat of what we're talking about. You see there's a bunch of puzzle mats in here, and that's because this project was made like a year ago, and these are super outdated. We don't do puzzle mats anymore. We do crypto mats. Crypto mats are the future. I'm going to keep talking about those for the next 2 years until every artist on the planet knows about crypto mats. They're so good. I'll come back to those. AOVs are your multipass. So these are all the information you can spit out of the render. I pretty much, when we're generating a project, especially when we're in look development, throw every AOV I can into this queue. Sometimes I don't know what kind of information I'm going to get out of the AOVs, and there's some exploration there, but there's some that I always find to be useful. So at the very least, shadows, specular lighting, the beauty pass, emissions if I have an emissive material, always, and reflections. That's kind of the baseline, but I'll show you there's a couple extra ones, like this bump normal, that we got some really interesting information out of that we ended up using in our composite. We didn't know that was the information we were going to get out of it. It wasn't until we started looking at the output of these AOVs that we found some really cool stuff in them. So our workflow for look dev, when we're just trying to figure out what the final frame is going to be, is to spit out all the AOVs and just, you have them. They're in your toolbox. Once I go to do the final render, I usually turn off the AOVs I'm not actually using, just for file management purposes and file size. So with that, let me open up the company composite file for this. And I can kind of show you how those AOVs come. So, you know, all the AOVs are in here. There's, you know, the buffers, and then there's the reflections and all that. And I can get into the full build of this. So the way that this is set up, this is the final pass. This layer, give it a second to load all those layers. So it's split down the middle, right? And this is just composite, so we just build one side at a time, and then again split it in After Effects. And if I come inside of here, this is the comp where we add all the type and all the little graphic bits and the depth of field blur. But if I come even one further, This is our color correction, and this is where we do all the compositing. So I was going to start this from scratch. I'm going to solo from the bottom up and just kind of show you how I build this. So I guess I could start by just flipping between the final color correction and the raw render. Not a huge change, but we increased the contrast. We shifted the colors to a darker, more burnt color scheme. Increased the shadows and tried to add a little more depth to it, or a little more dimension to it. So when you start compositing, one of my favorite compositing tricks, and probably what does the most compositing lifting for me, is to take my beauty pass, just duplicate it, and then set it to an overlay mode. Not always an overlay mode. I explore different blending modes, but just duplicate the beauty pass and then use a blending mode back on top of itself. So this actually, you can see a pretty huge difference, and it really increases the contrast. So what overlay does is it makes your darks darker, your whites whiter, and your colors more saturated. So I'll switch this to a blending mode, and then I'll just scrub the opacity. And I just kind of do this to figure out where I want to take this and the overall look I want to achieve. One thing that actually I'm a really big fan of as a final color correction pass, I'll just come out to the very final comp, duplicate the very, very final layer and set it to an overlay mode again. And this is kind of like a final contrast pass. I find this a little better than like tweaking levels because of how it also manipulates the colors. Anyway, I just think it's really, really powerful. Back to this one. So in addition, there's some other really good blending modes for compositing when duplicating a beauty pass on top of itself. Add mode gives you some really nice blooms and light thing up. Help if I had these turned on so we can see what I'm doing. Screen also increases brightness, but without causing it to bloom. Multiply is really good for darkening. Actually, multiply on this one gives a pretty cool result. Those are kind of the main ones I use. Of course, I kind of explore all the others as I go. There's sometimes I just click through all of them to see the results. So anyway, for this particular project, we actually use screen to brighten it a little. And then the next pass in our composite is exposure, which is actually, I think if I open up the effects tab here, the exposure is turned off. It's actually just levels. We're just removing this top white so it doesn't clip anymore, but we add that detail back in with other passes later. The next layer is shadow. And this is a shadow pass out of C4D. And I'm going to delete this mask, but I'm going to put it back on in a second. Shadow passes are really great for getting your bump detail, right? They always do a really good job of amplifying your bump. So especially when you're working with something like a cloth render, it's a really good way of getting all that texture information back in, or amplifying it. However, for this particular shadow pass, we just masked it in this gutter. And the idea is to increase this shadow in the middle here. If I turn that on and off, you can see. And this is one of my favorite compositing techniques. It seems so simple, but it's masking. It would take forever to position area lights to cast shadows into this gutter with this level of delicacy, where I can just drop this in, draw a mask in just a couple minutes, and a couple seconds really, and start to figure out the result I want. Also, if this is animating a mask is not murder. It's not possible. So I think people really sleep on feathered mask as compositing techniques, especially when you're using different AOVs, because you can pull out. It's just adding like shadow. It's not affecting the highlight of that gutter there. It's just affecting the shadow. So definitely a big fan of masking. It's on a multiply mode, so it darkens. The next one is a global shadow pass. This one's set to soft light, which means it's amplifying both the highlight. Soft light's a cousin of overlay. It's making the brights brighter and the darks darker. You can see we rated the opacity down 50%, so it's not coming in full power, but it just increases the shadows a little. The next layer is this bump normals, and what this does is it increases these highlights on these wrinkles. And again, you could come into Cinema and position a light and spend forever positioning a light to pick up all these wrinkles and highlight them, or you can do it in post. And it gives you a lot more control over it. But this one in particular I wanted to show because we stumbled across this. This is probably not how bump normals are intended to be used, but we kicked out this AOV and we looked at the information that was stored in it, and we noticed that because of camera angles, we were getting some pretty cool, this green channel was doing a pretty good job of highlighting these wrinkles. And we're like, well, let's emphasize that. That's a cool part of the cloth. It shows off the shape and form. So let's pull that information out. So we took this AOV, didn't use that as intended, did a shift channels to get the green to just be white. Did that for the red channel and the blue channel, composited those all together to kind of create our own custom map, and then brought that into to here, set it to a classic color dodge, added some levels, and added a glow. One thing that in particular the glow does. So if I just solo this layer entirely, actually here, I'll come into it. It's easier to see here. It's black and white. So the glow is just going to, glow these whites and make them a little softer. But with a lot of AOVs, especially when you get into these like really sort of narrow channels, they get a little grainy and they're not as like anti-A-list, I guess, as you want them to be. And we find with compositing, softening the passes usually makes things look a little more realistic. Sometimes those really hard edges or that anti-A-listing or the noise, it starts to make it's kind of a clue that this element is a CGI. So the glow just softens that by adding a little bit of like white bloom to the channel. We also do that with like a fast box blur set to 1. So it's just frequently when we go to composite these, we'll blend in a channel with a blur. I wanted to show this. We didn't actually use this effect, but it's kind of the opposite of that. So it's a really cool effect called the unsharpened mask, and it does exactly the opposite of what is. I'm going to solo these just so we don't have this top layers on top. But what it does is it increases the amount of grain in detail. So you can see if I dial this way up, it really, really pulls out the bump and the texture. And this is really great if you have a render and you're just like, that sand doesn't look rough enough, or I want this cloth to have a little more detail to it. You can dial that up. In this case, we thought we had enough. We were pretty happy with the balance, so we didn't end up using it. But it is a really cool effect just for increasing your texture. The next channel here is a shadow pass that we're using as a color correction pass. And the reason being is we like the data in it, right? We only wanted to color correct the highlights, not the shadows, which is kind of the inverse. You can see we achieved that by applying a tint to the shadow pass, so all the whites became orange and the black stayed black. And that's the inverse of like a photo filter effect, which I think is another really just strong compositing technique that I'm going to talk about just a little. So photo filters are for tinting shadows. So you can see this photo filter is turned all the way up to 100%. It's way too hot, but the dark areas are getting blue and the white areas are staying white. This is really powerful when you're trying to combine CGI with live action, because when you shoot something on camera, there's going to be some kind of color temperature to your shot. So your shadows are not going to be pure black values. And you see this all the time in like the sci-fi original movies, especially if you turn up the gamma on your TV. The black like halo and shadow of the creature is pure black. They didn't tint its color to match the scene, so that halo shows up and you can see that they're not composited. It's a really good way of blending a CG element or multiple CG elements together, or CG and live action, where they don't all have the same like color temperature and shadow values. A good rule of thumb is if it's nighttime, put a cooling photo filter on it. If it's daytime, put a warming photo filter on it. Usually the default value is like 25%, which does a lot better with the subtlety. And actually you can kind of just see like the shift between that. It makes that whole scene feel a little warmer and a little more burnt. Again, we didn't use it on this one, but I actually think it's a really good way, if you aren't rendering everything from one scene, to kind of blend it together so it feels like it was all part of the same shot. Photo filters are good. The next layer we have is reflections. These are pretty straightforward. These two reflection passes just have these highlights. They pick up the color of the cloth really well, and we just really wanted to amplify that highlight. I think it looks particularly good on here. So, we added the reflection passes back in. Pretty subtle change. There's a film grain here. This much like adding a 1% blur to things just adds a little bit of realness. We felt like this cloth texture had enough visual noise to it as it was that we didn't need to use it on this particular composite. But it's a good way if you have a lot of hard surfaces to, again, add just a little bit of that real world camera grit and grain. I would say both with the photo filter and the film grain, like less is more. Do it with a subtle touch. I feel like if you look at something and say, that's grainy, you added too much grain. But if you don't notice it, you probably did it right. So anyway, that's kind of our color correction build. And this is, I would say, a pretty standard compositing stack for us. We pull in all the multi-channels. We see what values they have. We kind of have in our mind a look we want to achieve with them. We look at our beauty pass. We're like, okay, that beauty pass is a little flat. We want a little more dimensionality. We want to highlight the curves a little more contrast. And then we use the multi-passes to get us there. So with that, we'll take this color correction pass and we do a few more things of compositing. So we almost always do post-production depth of field blur. In-camera depth of field looks better, almost always, but comes with basically no flexibility. Once that render is baked in, that depth of field is there. And in addition, you can't add things like player photos or player names and have it get blurred with the in-camera. So we almost always use post depth of field. We use Frischlift, which is a paid program. It's worth the money. Does a very good job. There is a camera lens blur by default in After Effects that does. It's terrible. So Frischlift does a really good job to add a depth of field. And the way that it works is it pulls off a depth map, so which is another AOV that's spit out. So I'll open up my, see it's referencing a depth layer here. And actually here I'll come in here and do it this way. So a depth map is white to black values. In theory, what's white is purely in focus and what is black is out of focus. You can change that. For this, it's like middle gray is in focus and white and black are both out. And how dark it is how much blur it's getting or how bright it is. So one thing I like to do with my depth pass is composite it just like I would do the beauty pass, particularly by overlaying it on top of itself. So I'll put it on overlay and I'll just duplicate this up just a boatload of times. You see that really pushes the contrast of this pass. And one thing I thought was particularly interesting about this one is that the displacement map data was in that pass, but I didn't even know it was there from the naked eye. And once you really ratchet up the contrast, you can see that. You could also do this with levels, but I find like selecting the depth pass and mashing Apple D a bunch of times to be pretty rewarding. So that's a good way of getting that out of there. So you can see as I turn that up, like now we have this really shallow depth of field, which is a pretty cool effect, to be honest. It does look good. It wasn't ultimately the look we wanted, but it is a cool effect. So I want to show you just real quick how I set up these depth passes. They're pretty simple to set up. There's one little technique with the camera that I think helps with the efficiency of it. So I'll just show you how I build that. I'm also going to show you how to set them up in standard render versus Redshift. So let's just make a little scene here. You can see the depth. Get some cubes. Cool. Let's create a camera. Turn that on. All right, cool. So in the standard render, if I come to multipass and just add a depth pass, and I just hit render on this, we'll see over here in the layer, like it's already working, right? More or less. You can see how it gradients back. But with the depth pass, it's only black to white. I want my full scene to be inside of that. And I want as much information in there as possible so that when I go to pull it in After Effects, I can pick any part of it. Like if I wanted this rear cube to be in focus, that data just isn't in this depth pass currently. So I find the easiest way to set up that depth pass to capture all the data is I like to do it with visual feedback. So if you click to a view where you can see most of your scene, come to the camera and go details and enable this depth of field map front blur, it gives you these handles. So if I drag this to roughly the end of the scene and the start to roughly the beginning, and I run this again, you'll see that now the front object is bright white and the back one is pushing back to gray. And you could dial this in a little bit more, but you get a pretty good spectrum of information this way. And it's really easy to animate if you want to animate the depth of field, and you can just see what you're doing. Worth noting, depth passes, you want to do at least 16-bit, if not 32. There's just not that information. For just a grayscale, 8-bit really struggles to give you the information, the color depth information you want to get good depth passes. Go ahead and show you how to set this up in Redshift if you wanted to do it there. I find the standard render to be a little more intuitive and a little easier. There's actually two passes I still spit out of the standard render just for efficiency. It's the depth pass and the material UVW, just because they kind of work with one click. If you are going to spit these out, you can do them in Redshift too. It's just a little more complicated to set up. But if you're going to do them in standard render, when I set up this, I'll set it up as separate render settings. And the options I like to do is anti-aliasing set to geometry. And then over here, I just turn off everything. I don't need transparency, reflections, shadows, or blurriness. And this will render super, super fast. So anyway, if I wanted to set this up in Redshift, I just want to show this because there is like just a couple little tricks you got to click to get this to work in Redshift. Drag the depth channel in. You want to set this to Z normalized inverted, or normalized work, but Z normalized inverted gives you the same output as the standard render. And then this use camera near far is actually pulling information from the camera clipping, which is a little troublesome to use because it'll actually clip those objects out of the scene. So I uncheck that and I input the values manually. So I'll just copy. I'll still visually measure it in here, and I'll just copy the value from here and paste it into here. And then the Redshift will spit out a depth map that's the same as what we just saw. This is, again, a little less intuitive and can't be animated, where this, you just drop the keyframes if you want to animate it. So that's why I like doing it in standard render. Anyway, that's depth pass. So that's kind of, I would say, a pretty standard composite for us. But like I said, with this project in particular, we needed some way of doing this displacement not in 3D. So we had to up the composite a little bit more. We still definitely wanted to maintain the look, mostly because the client had approved this look, and it's probably too late to change it. But we had to do the whole displacement in After Effects. So I'll show you how we pulled that off, and it's with material UVWs, which actually I think are really powerful. And I again, if I was a betting person, I would say they're going to get a little more traction in the years to come, just because I think there's a lot of post-production flexibility with them. So let me open up the After Effects for that. Don't worry about these missing effects or fonts. Not important. Cool. So this one hates loading that license. It will refresh in a minute and decide it's going to work, but for now it's not going to. So you can see here we have this country outline that's being displaced slightly. It looks like it's raised up from the rest of the cloth background, and I'll show that cloth background just to see what it looks like clean. So this is what, that is not what it is. This one. This is what came out of the render. So it's just a clean piece of cloth, and we added that displacement to it. And like I said, we did that with material UVWs. So what a material UVW pass is, it spits out red-green color information that tells After Effects how the UVs of a particular object are laid out. There's a couple catches with this, though. It has to store all of that 3D information in just the red-green color channel, which is a tall ask, which means you definitely need the full color space for this. If I was to take this project and change it to 8-bit, and I was to go back to the composite, you'll see it gets really jagged. There's just not enough color information for it to know how to map that on that surface. And that displacement waves with the cloth. It's probably a little hard to get it to render in real time, but if I can scrub as the cloth moves, that displacement moves. So you want to be at 32-bit. In addition, your working color space has to be none, because it needs that pure red-green color value. Now, if your project is built with a color space, this is going to be problematic. So you have to do an override for just this pass. So if I come to this pass and I go to Interpret Footage Main, go to Color Management and click that Preserve RGB, that will strip the color management from just this UVW pass. And again, to set up a UVW pass, actually here I'll show it on this one. Let's jump this camera back to a good angle. It's really easy. So if I go to the standard render, multi-pass, click UVW. That's it. That's all you have to do. You just click UVW. Oh, it's going to render. Hang on. I don't need the full mode, but it does render pretty fast. Just need the current frame. And you can see here if I go to single pass, that UVW is spit out. So once you get that spit out, you have to get it mapped on there. Now there is a catch. UVW mapping is not default, does not come default with After Effects. It's third-party plugin only. However, there's a very good free version that works great. There's also a paid version by Revision, the same people who do Real Smart Motion Blur. We use that one just because it has a few extra handles, and we thought it gave us a couple more options. So if I come to the layer where all that is set up, actually here, let me try just, I think if I click this, that might go away. That should refresh now in a minute. Anyway, or not. So the way that this scene is set up, this background layer is clean. We have this pre-comp, which is the texture that's going to be mapped onto our 3D. Although that layer just gets turned off, sits in the scene. And then this is the UVW pass. So if you turn off the effect, you can see it's just our UVW color pass. So we throw this plugin on there. This is the remap UVW, and it will map this on here. Now by default, if I click reset, well, I have to pick the texture. Wrong texture. You're going to see we get a weird result, like the country's off over there. So you're going to have to dial these settings in about how to repeat it and where to tile it and when to flip it and where to offset it. And it takes just a little bit to dial this in. Now, the reason being is it's using the UVW pass of the 3D, which is pretty complicated. But if you wanted to clean that up in the 3D and make it really simple for the program, you could come in and throw just any material on your object, and you could set the mapping of this tag to just flat. So right now it just it pulls off whatever UV was there. But if you set that to flat and position this flat UVW, it's going to make a really, really clean projection. So if I was to spit this UV back out and like where it's just a plane, that's exactly how it's going to project that on there. And it will still have the curves. It will understand that, but this will give it a really clean start. So some objects I find when I drop the UVW pass in, my material UVWs were set up in a pretty clean way anyway, and it was fine and it just works. But other times I'll just come in here and throw a dummy material on here with a flat projection just to get a nice clean UVW into the program. Anyway, okay. So once you get that there, you set this up, you tweak all your settings. Let's see if I can undo this to back to where it was working. Cool. And then it maps this texture on there. And this puzzle mat just cuts out the garbage we don't need. So once we had this as a mat on here, this is just a guide layer. It doesn't actually get spit out of this. Once we had that mat out here, we really had all the handles we needed to do this displacement. So I'll just show you that composite real quick, but it's pretty simple. All those layers are motion. So here's our base layer. And then the first thing we added was a transform. So this transform is pulling an alpha mat from the mat we just created. And what a transform is doing is it's scaling up that texture image. So it's making it larger anywhere that appears. So if I turn this up, you can see pretty well. There's a cool technique with transform I want to show you real fast for generating glass. It's just really handy. So if I make a solid, send this to very top of the comp, make that solid an adjustment layer. Transform. Throw transform on there, turn that up to like 105. Come to blur, add a fast box blur, turn that up to like 25. Rotate this. You can see we get that. It's like a really easy way of doing that like refracted glass technique or blurry glass, and it's pretty much instant, and it renders really fast. It's like a poor man's refraction, but it's a really easy way of setting that up. And of course, this could be like a object buffer from a 3D object. That reminds me, I forgot to show crypto mats. I'll do that at the end as far as object buffer goes. Anyway, so the first step was to add this transform, and that just makes it look like the displaced area is a little bit closer to camera. The next thing we did was add a drop shadow to just make it look like that little bit closer to camera is putting a little shadow on its neighbors. We blurred that drop shadow just a little to help with the composite. We then did the same thing with the outline. We gave it a little push towards the camera, and then we gave the outline a drop shadow. We then took the outline, gave it a bevel alpha, which just gives it this little highlight. I can turn that up and you can probably see that a little better. And that was really most of the composite. The rest of this is just kind of what I did on the other scene to up contrast and all that jazz. But I'll show you how to build one of these so I can show you how to change the color if I wanted to absolutely do the full thing and recolor the flag in the middle. So I'm just going to rebuild this. So first thing is I'm going to duplicate this texture pre-comp. Call it Mexican Displace Color. I'm going to come to this UVW map pre-comp, turn on the guides, see what we're doing. Duplicate that. Call it color. Come here. I'm pretty sure it's me somewhere in there. Cool. All right. So I'm going to come into this channel and throw this flag texture in here and scale it up. And then I'm going to come to this one. I'm going to swap this for the color channel we just made. So you can see it's now mapping the flag onto here. And the flag moves with the cloth because the cloth undulates. And the UVWs tell it all that information. And then come back to this comp. Duplicate this here. I'm going to duplicate this. Actually, I think I want this one. I'm going to duplicate this twice because I'm going to use one as the matte still. So I'm going to drag the color one in here, replace it, and it's pulling a Luma matte from the shape. So cool. Pretty easy to get that on there as color. We can use some blending modes to actually transfer this color. So one of my favorites is, and this is actually a pretty cool technique to recolor anything with texture, is set this to color mode, duplicate this group, and then set the layer above it to overlay. That stack of color to overlay does a really good job of transferring color data to texture while maintaining the low lights and highlights of the texture. So this is actually, and this is at half res. It looks a little better at full. This did a pretty good job. I'd probably manually tweak that red a little. And one thing that's really appealing about this UVW workflow is that crest isn't quite centered. I can just come back to this one, displace color, and just kind of nudge that over. And then it moves it over. And that's a little easier to dial in post than it is, especially when like Japan has a really skinny country contour. You have to really get it placed perfectly in there. I really like that workflow of just being able to update the texture over here. I could add text or anything to here and it'd map onto there. You could actually go as far to retexture the entire scene. Like I could drop a jersey mesh into this UVW and just wipe out that entire. If there was a jersey, actually, I think I have a jersey mesh. Yeah, I did. I brought one. want it in here. This isn't the highest quality jersey mesh ever. I think I would want something with a lot more density to look good. But I could put a new texture on here. And for look dev, this is a really, really fast way of, and here, let me just turn this off of the mat. If I was like, well, what does this look like? What does this scene look like if it's jersey mesh instead of like the cloth we had? And you can get that result pretty quickly, which is just a cool way to test it. Oh man, you know what drives me crazy? That texture density of that jersey mesh. I'd want it like that. But anyway, but you can see you can swap the entire texture of the scene in post. Again, not going to be as good as a real displace or a real bump that you get out of cinema, but if you're just trying to figure out what texture looks good and you want to do it quickly, it's a really good way of getting there. So one last thing I want to show you with this, actually just riding on the heels of this recolor technique I did with the flag here. That overlay mode, or that color overlay mode stack, works really, really, really well at putting field lines on playing fields, on pitches. So I have this image of grass with a field line painted on it, which I think is just a good example, so we can benchmark against it. Throw this on here, scale it up, pre-comp it to lock in that scale. And then if I take this and I go color, wrong one, color, duplicate it, and go overlay, I mean, right out the door, that's a pretty good, that's a pretty good transfer. But if I was really going to push this, I would do roughen edges. I've done this a million times to put field lines on turfs. So sports graphics is a very popular thing. I'm going to solo this just so I can see what I'm doing. Just add some roughness to this. Sure. I would probably spend 10 minutes dialing in that roughen edges if I was actually doing this. Paste that on here as well. Turn on all the layers. I mean, for 30 seconds, that is not a bad composite of putting field lines on grass. One thing that, to go back to the photo filters I was talking about earlier, you see the shadows down here are cool. They have that little blue tint. If we really, really wanted to push this, duplicate this, tell it to alpha matte, got an adjustment layer here, turn it off, go effects. We could put a photo filter on here and start. I did that wrong. I want this one. There we go. Switch this to a cooling filter. So you can see that blue's a little bit different shade than the blue in the scene. They have a couple options. Yeah, that one's pretty close. And I turned that down to like, I don't know, 15%, still too high. 5%. That's starting to get pretty close. Like it's a pretty close match for a composite. You could dial that in forever, but again, for a minute, that's a pretty quick way of transferring field lines onto a texture. Okay, so I'll show you I think that's kind of it for the AOV compositing. I'll show you Cryptomats really, really fast, the setup on that, and then I think that's it for me. So let me open up the project file for this. I think it's in compositing. Yeah. Okay. So to build a Cryptomat, and actually I probably should explain what a Cryptomat is in case you don't know. A Cryptomat creates object buffers. It selects objects that spits out mats, so you can select them individually and color correct them. The old workflow, of course, was to put a tag on every single object, select an object ID for that tag, and assign it. And you do this for everything in your scene so that each one got a different output. Cryptomats do all of that automatically for free with no effort. Delete these out of here and just show you how you set them up. You do have to use Redshift, and they do have to render as EXRs, so there's those limitations, but totally worth it. Over here, you just grab Cryptomat, drag it over. By default, it's set to object name, which means it will spit out a mat for every single object in the scene. Usually, we create 2 mats for every scene. The other one is the material name, and this will create a mat for every different material. So everything that shares a material will share a mat. Hit render on those. I pre-rendered them, but I'll bring them in and show you how to use them. 3D renders, this one, object and material. Cool. Here, we'll do the object one. So if you just look at this pass, it shows up as black. So you do need an effect to pull that out. It's called, aptly named, Cryptomat. If you throw that on here, you see all these different colors represent everything that could be a potential mat. With this effect selected, I just click on what I want. and this becomes the mat. I can hold Shift to add to this if I want to make multiple mats, or I can hold Alt to subtract from it. I come over here and set it to mat only. Now I have a luminance channel that I can clip out just those objects. You can change them on the fly. It updates in real time. I get to pick the mats in my viewport in After Effects in the render. It's so good. This would have saved me so many hours. I think that's it. I think that's everything for me. Yeah, I think that's the whole game. Cool.
Fantastic stuff, Eric. So I'm unsure. Should we be using cryptomats or not?
The jury's still out. I'll get back to you in a couple of years if it. Yeah. Absolutely.
That was really great advice you said earlier on about a red flag for artists when they're using standard rather than a renderer.
The future is now, man. We've come a little ways. Yeah. Standard render doesn't cut it anymore.
Exactly, because of what you can then do with those multi-passes and cryptomats.
Yeah, there's no cryptomats in standard. Absolutely, yeah.
And what was jumping out to me was some really interesting things that you did about the softening passes to make things a little less CGE. And then also that box blur refraction tip.
Sure. Well, I've more or less made a living off that box blur reflection trick for the first few years of my career. We've actually found we've dialed that in even more. You can put like a turbulence displace in there and add a couple other like an animated displacement channel, and you can get that refraction to look completely convincing. Add a little chromatic aberration to that adjustment layer, and like you don't even have to do those in camera. And then for the blur, I think one of the biggest challenges of CG that is getting better is like everything is so rigid and hard by default, and us as CG artists spend so much time trying to add in the little imperfections that actually make things realistic. So and blur just makes it so you don't have to. It's a little more forgiving with a blur on it.
I mean, it's interesting. I was having a series of conversations yesterday with people about the number of passes versus rendering out of cinema and so on. And so I think they need to watch. This should be required viewing, this session for that.
Absolutely.
Because all those small little things you're saying about this is how you bring out the texture and this is how you actually make like the line fields trick and doing all those things at the last minute as the client changes their mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, with the look development process, some of design is discovery and some of it's intention, and I think you can just sort of set yourself up for success by having all the possible discovery tools, all the pieces laid out on the table, and maybe you find a piece of information in one of those passes that really plays well. So yeah.
And that's interesting also, that color management tip, because this is something that isn't necessarily jumps up on people setting up their projects properly.
I am confident that no one on the planet actually understands color spaces. But through some trial and error, we have found color depth is important. And yeah, that can definitely, if your UVW mats are smearing and look weird and you're not getting the results you want, it's probably a color space is like a really good place to start as one of the potential issues.
And that other 16 versus 8 versus 32 bit constantly comes up. Absolutely. So this could you bring up your information about where we can find more about you?
I don't have a slide for my information. I didn't, but I am on the internet.
Well, we have your details on 3dmotionshow.com.
Perfect.
So anyone who wants to link to you more can please go there. And also on 3D Motion Show, you can sign up to find out more information about when the next presentations are coming up. When we invite Eric back to do another one.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah. I'll be back for sure. I'd love to.
Fantastic. That'd be amazing.
Holding you to that.
Excellent. So thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
And do stay around because we are only moments away from the final session of the day by the one and only Noseman. And that's coming up just in a couple of minutes. But thanks again, Eric. That was amazing.
Awesome. Thank you very much.